Can I just begin by saying that it has been an immense pleasure, as what I suppose in the vernacular of the day I might describe as a cultural adjacent institution, to welcome all of you here, and of course to address so very grand a theme, which is of course belief and beauty, the spiritual world of Isabella, Stewart, Gardner. It's not my place to presume too much upon the agenda for this session, and we are fortunate to have joining us Rachel Teubner, who is our senior fellow for the current season here at the Advent, and I've asked Rachel actually to open, as it were, with an initial response, beyond which I think the obvious first question would be for each of our participants to think a little bit, which is why I'm going to raise it now, about what they've seen as uniquely interesting and what they've learned from hearing each other today. But as I just reflect on my own experience, and just that point about being secular, about being religious adjacent in our case, cultural adjacent in our case, religious adjacent in the case of the museum, I have another hat which I've worn from time to time, which is on dealing with international and intergovernmental institutions, as they grandly call themselves. And in that domain, I've encountered what I would call the international relations mindset. And that generally wants to say something about religion, which is that they've reluctantly come to see it as an important factor, but they also want to say that we don't do it as international relations people. And so as soon as you get something embarking on this terrain, taking or trying to grapple with how religion affects international relations, which prima facie is a big question, they'll switch it and say it's about culture. And I'm always struck by the immediacy of the switch. And that just brings me, to some degree, to think about, again, wearing my other hat being a sort of philosopher of religion in the background, about some of the claims implicit in what we do want to say, the way that the theme has been proposed, belief and beauty, and the way we have touched upon the theme in analysis, would suggest that we do, for example, want to say that there are truth claims involved in the beauty, one of the great values of the beauty as experienced in the museum and so forth, and what Isabella Stewart Gardner has made available is an insight into truth, for example. That, it seems to me, would raise some very interesting questions about what it is to have differing views of the truth claims and how we might reconcile them. And that would have something to do with a further thought, which is, I might think, again, I think would want to raise what are the presuppositions we bring to the analysis. To reveal perhaps one of my own, I'd be inclined to say that there are some parallels between religion and language, in that you can usually only speak one at a time. And I think that's an interesting perspective, even if we want to embrace a view which is transcendent of several languages or whatever. There's a sense in which we can reflect on the phenomenon of language, but there's an interesting perspective there to think about. So those are some of the things to which I have been stimulated in thinking about the many questions raised. But as I say, the overall theme of the day has of course been belief and beauty, and I think to invite our very eminent and extremely successful speakers today in addressing the topics which they addressed, it would be perhaps think about some of the questions that they have found raised and some of the most interesting answers to which the discourse has given rise. And before we get to that, I would ask Rachel for your initial response to the day, as it were. Thank you.
Thank you. This has been utterly delightful. I've learned so much. I wanted to start just by saying a little bit about how I come to this material, because I'm not a scholar of Isabella Stewart Gardner, unlike my colleagues here at the table. And I actually first encountered Isabella Stewart Gardner because I'm a scholar of Dante. And Isabella Stewart Gardner was part of the Dante Society. She read Dante, she knew Dante. And I also have a research interest in women's religiosity and its association with households, which is a sort of what we could call a trans-historical theme. The household being a place of labor for women, also of learning for women, and both of those things being connected with women's piety. You have that in Israelite religion, you have it in early Christian households, and it goes on. It goes on into the medieval period, and I'm not even thinking of convents and religious women in that sense. I'm thinking of lay women who cared for religious objects in their households and convened communities in their households, and whose households became centers of learning that were an alternative to traditional schools and universities, and therefore became particularly significant as a place for women's learning, although they didn't exclude men by any means. So it's interesting to me to think of Isabella Stewart Gardner as participating in that very old and long historical pattern. Obviously, she's someone who did that with extraordinary assets and opportunities. And I think in a way she seems to be an example of someone who pushes that pattern almost to the breaking point. She made her house a place of learning, and then she built a palace, moved into it, and opened it to the public. So that her household was both a household and a public institution. And that's a very interesting development in this very long history of women's religiosity and its association with households. And she also, as Father Ian beautifully put it, reversed that pattern by beginning to contribute to the adornment of a house of prayer, this one, among others. So I'm interested in her in that way, and lots of information has been presented to us that day that gives us a better understanding, a very detailed, much more granular understanding of her piety than I could have had previously. So I think that's a very interesting thing to reflect on. I'm also conscious that we have talked about Isabella Stewart Gardner's religiosity in terms of belief, and by no means do I want to quibble with the title of this conference, Belief and Beauty, but I do want to ask the question, what happens if we start to think about Isabella Stewart Gardner's religious faith in terms of religious practices? We have been presented with many of her habits, interests, activities, which clearly fall under that gamut. I'm thinking of Brother James's talk and all that he was able to present us, again, in a wonderfully granular way about the way that she practiced. She was taught to pray by Brother Hall. I got that right? Father Hall, thank you. And I was actually asking Brother James about this during the break, and I won't put you on the spot, but I found it very interesting to hear from Brother James that the way she was probably taught to pray was informed by the Jesuit practice of reflecting on Scripture and almost sort of inserting oneself into that drama. So Christian scriptures may have almost certainly did play a prominent role in the way that she practiced prayer, shaped her prayer life. We also learned something of her care for the sick, her care for the friendless. I'm thinking of Mook, a friendless person who received significant care from her when he did not have friends. And also her care for the objects of worship. I was delighted to discover about this woman who's sort of known for being, I don't know, just sort of ornate, aristocratic, enormously wealthy, that she also did things like scrubbing the steps and washing the altar, and was head of the altar guild and put on the blue serge, which is it's a very striking thing to learn about a woman who was known for her gowns and pearls. Yeah. So there are those pieces of her religious practice, which also, I think, point to her belief. And then I wonder about other things we know about her practices, which might also be considered religious? Where do we draw the line? It's a question I have. So her collecting, and beyond collecting, her interest in what we might call illuminating the stories of faith, the practices of faith, the narratives of Scripture, the lives of the saints. She had an interest in illuminating those objects that enrich the life of faith, and in creating this exquisitely hospitable environment for what? For deepening the experience of religion, for emotioning, to use a word that's a word that appeared as a quote from Isabella Stewart Gardner about a Christmas midnight mass that was celebrated in her private chapel. Everything was beautiful and emotioning. This is what she said of a Christmas mass celebrated in 1906, which does seem to have been an aspiration of hers, emotioning. She had to make up her own word, apparently, to communicate it. I wonder if that was, in a way, part of how she consciously or unconsciously pursued a vocation. She was interested in increasing our sort of sensitivities, our affectivities, inviting people to become more touched by the beauty of holiness, deepening faith and affectivity in that sense. That seems to have been a significant part of her vocation, what motivated her. I'll say one more thing that stuck out to me. It hasn't been mentioned today, but it appears in Natalie's wonderful biography. And I was talking with Dan about this earlier. There's a fireplace in the Raphael room, and probably Italian, probably 15th century.
Yeah.
We'll see. But it has the phrase over it, et motu et lumine, by motion and illumination, which is an ellipsis. It's not even a complete sentence, but it's a very suggestive phrase, and it seems to me to capture something of what Isabella's faith motivated her to do. She was a woman who was in constant motion, enormously active, but possibly to poor Jack's dismay.
Poor Jack.
Poor exhausted Jack.
Yeah. His bad news. Yeah.
But the end goal of so much of her motion, so much of her activity seems to have been illumination of those truths that she held most dear. Father Alistair was inviting us to reflect on truth claims, and I haven't really touched on that, but I do think that all of those practices have truth claims toward which they point, or truth claims that are implicit within them. And I think that's worth exploring. So I will end there and hand things over to someone else.
I think we might work through the panel, if that might be, on your reflections each. Would that be possible?
Sure. So who's next?
Like the port, it passes to the left.
I know. I feel like I should pose a question and pass it on. I think that's a beautiful reflection about, and again, this is going to be biased from the museum, from the position of someone working in a museum, of how you, what she's illuminating as people move through the space. And I think it's interesting, we're in the midst of all sorts of audience research, and you may or may not have expected it, but the Gardner is majority under 40 visitation. We are extremely popular with Gen Z. It's our biggest demo. There are a couple of reasons for this. We are a Instagram fever dream. TikTok too. The theft is a constant hook, for better or worse. But something that we're finding is that Gardner's own, what feels like a highly personal hybrid approach to spirituality, where you can find your own truth in the environment, is really appealing to a generation that views that is increasingly I am spiritual but not religious, that is looking for, they can find meaning in a yoga class or on a mountain or in church. And the Gardner can do all of those things for them. We have a garden in the courtyard. We have a patron saint in Isabella. We have any number of religions under the sun. And you actually circumambulate our space. And so I think that that's really beautifully touched upon, that illumination of truth can be many truths, depending on whose truth or what truth someone was looking for. I guess I'll pass it to my left. Yes?
Oh, yes, maybe.
Okay. Oh, no. There's a cord. Okay, there we go.
Following someone who's extraordinary at extemporizing, it's a little intimidating. And I guess there's so many things swirling through my mind. One thing is that she would be so delighted that the museum draws all these young people, because young people were so important to her, and she was so good at fostering relationships with generations coming up. I mean, she really wanted to give musicians a chance to have their music played. She sometimes supported artists that kind of had a low ceiling as compared to others, but she didn't give up on them. George Proctor is an example of that. Sort of, yeah, more hope than glory. And but others offer just extraordinary opportunities to young people. Right? She just loved to be in their presence. And there's these wonderful photographs that were found, I don't know if Trip Evans found them at the New England, historic New England. A. Piatt Andrew was a very close friend, and quite a bit younger, 25 years younger, on Eastern Point. And they would she would go out there for Thanksgiving, and she would go out in the spring of the year, her favorite time of year, and there's all these snapshots, and it's all these young people, and sometimes they're in costumes, and then there's Isabella, and you can immediately identify her because she's dressed in these kind of wonderfully eccentric costumes, either all white, all black, sometimes she has like a black veil and a white dress, but it's so dear, it's so wonderful, because they so enjoyed her company, and she so much wanted their success, right? And so that's what made me, I was really happy about that stat that you gave us. What an extraordinary day to see Isabella in her kaleidoscopic life. And so there's so many ways to enter into the story, just like the museum, there's so many ways to enter in, and sometimes you only see 2 galleries, sometimes you see the whole museum. And I always thought of her as having this kaleidoscopic personality. There were so many different ways to understand her, and I think that was very well represented today. I did have a very specific question for Diana about the palazzo, about the sanctified space, did you call it? Consecrated space. Were there consecrated spaces in Venetian palazzos? There were chapels in those palazzos. And so in English country houses. And so I always wondered if that was also where she had, that she was adopting that idea. So, yeah, it was just really thrilling to hear all these voices in a single day about Isabella. So.
Thank you. I think the thing that struck me most repeatedly throughout the day, perhaps unsurprisingly, was the whole question of belief or beliefs, plural, the multi-faith thing, which we've come at from a number of directions, which I think has been fascinating. And the thing that the thought that has recurred to me several times as we've done that is that Isabella was clearly a woman ahead of her time in all sorts of ways. And I then reflected on some of the teaching documents of the Second Vatican Council, which talk about, and I don't have them in front of me, so I'm not quoting directly, but talk about other belief systems having hints of the truth and elements of the truth and pointing towards the truth and helping people of good faith find their way to the truth. Now, those teaching documents are then also very clear that the fullness of truth is found in Jesus Christ. But that sense that other belief systems have elements of truth, point to the truth, all that sort of stuff, that's a remarkable divergence from what the Roman Catholic Church was teaching about other faiths before the Second Vatican Council. And so I just wonder whether one way of viewing Isabella's approach to all of that, given the conversations we've had earlier today, is to say that that is dare we even say, in preempting some of the teaching of the Second Vatican Council, is one of the ways in which she was a woman remarkably ahead of her time.
She was modern. There was an aspect of her that was, she embraced the modern. She wasn't afraid of the future. And she loved, cars and airplanes and technology, right? And of course she was a name on the program for the Armory Show, which was the great art show of modern art that traveled, was first in New York, then Chicago, and then Boston. And so I in those last chapters of her life, I was always struck by how forward-thinking she was, right? She was not nostalgic, even though the museum is so much about past, different kinds of pasts. She was not nostalgic. Do you want to?
And I definitely want to give
Yes.
room to this side, but I'll just say, I think the genius of the museum and being sort of, it can come across as like Miss Havisham-esque. It's like frozen in time. We don't have quite as many cobwebs. No abandoned cake sitting around. Anyway, but the genius of it, I think, is that because it doesn't change, it can be perpetually responsive to the people all around it.
Yeah.
So I think you see other traditional museums struggling to try to feel relevant by changing what's in there and what is on display. What's interesting for us is we're not allowed to do that. We do special exhibitions, but we can try to tell new stories.
Yes.
And so it's interesting that in being frozen, it becomes timeless and can feel forward-looking.
Yeah.
Which
Which
I think maybe has something to do, to come back to her faith, with her attachment perhaps to an Anglo-Catholic approach to faith, right? With maybe liturgies that aren't just trying to follow the wind or like a focus on text. And then that feels analogous to me in my limited understanding of her Anglo-Catholic faith. That maybe that's a perfect segue to James.
There is a Russian Orthodox theologian, I'm not going to remember his name, so don't ask me, who once said that beauty will save the world. Yeah.
The world will be saved by beauty.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. And that, in a sense, is sort of very Anglican, because we talk about, worship the Lord in the beauty of holiness. And so the revelation of God is through beauty. And so we see in the museum sort of the revelation of God as we see all these beautiful things. So that's one thing. The other thing that somebody asked a question, I'm not going to get your question right, but if you had asked me the question, the question had been, what would you say or what would you ask Mrs. Gardner? And I think as sort of my role as a member of SSJE, the role that we played in her life as her spiritual director, I think the question that I would ask her is, who is Jesus? and engage her in that way to find out who Jesus is for her. During the break, Rachel and I were talking, and she asked me what did this mean when I said, and I think I was actually quoting Natalie when I said that Father Hall had taught her to pray. Rachel asked me what that meant. One of the other, if you remember that picture of Father Benson with the beard surrounded by all of those African American children. One of the other people in that picture, which I didn't point out to you and I didn't talk about, but I could have, was Father Longbridge. He was standing kind of behind Father Benson. Father Longbridge was also a member of the society. He translated the Ignatian exercises into English, and for a long time, his translation, as an Anglican, was the English text for the Jesuits in all English-speaking provinces of the Jesuits. But the Ignatian method of prayer is to enter into the story, and people were talking about entering into the story in the museum, so you could very easily enter into the story. So, well, we can't say for sure what Mrs. Gardner might have understood as prayer. We could guess, I think, because of the society's being deeply anchored in the Ignatian exercises, we can guess that how Father Hall was teaching her to pray was through the Ignatian exercises, which is you take a passage of the Gospels and then you imagine yourself in that place. So you take a healing story, for instance, and you imagine yourself in that story. You know, are you an observer? Are you the one being healed? Are you the one being forgiven? How do you encounter that story if you were in it? And the last thing I'll say was just there wasn't very much, if any, conversation between us as to what we were going to say, but I was fascinated by the fact that some of the things I said, for instance, the story about that little girl, Belle Manning, in the hospital, and Mrs. Gardner, being asked to help her, and then the story of the conductor of the Boston Symphony, and just how that kind of theme played out over and over and over again in her life. So that's one of the things that struck me.
No pressure, right? I like that word you used, Natalie, kaleidoscope, because I think that this whole row of us kind of creates a kaleidoscope for how we can interpret all of the things we've talked about, and it's just so interesting to watch that happen in real time, because when Rachel said truth, I, of course, admitting to my own biases and lens, will always hear the word truth with a capital T. I find a lot of freedom in being an absolutist, and always just, again, with the Irish Catholic, right? To me, the truth is singular, and anything else, we talk about your truth, my truth, multiple truths, I receive them as oxymorons. But it's been really fascinating to receive each other's takes and opinions, and if there's one thing I get to say right now, I just am blown away that I get to be here with you guys today. It means so much to learn from you all, and everything that I wrote my talk on comes from the books written by these people. And even brother was like, hey, where'd you get that quote? And I told him about the web page I found, and he said, I wrote that. Two things. In the absence of a paper trail from Isabella's correspondences, I think the most accurate paper trail that would speak to what she truly believed would be her receipts. And that's why I found your talk so interesting, brother. I was thinking, so when you brought up Jeff Bezos, because I was thinking about him while we were, just thinking about Jeff Bezos again. Because I was thinking, just to make this totally about me, I was thinking about, okay, what if a historian was going to study my life and try to discern my beliefs hundreds of years from now? And they would find a lot of angry text messages and conversations between my friends disavowing Jeff Bezos and the like. And they would also also find even more Amazon receipts. And you really do get to the core of who I am based on how I spend my treasure. Isabella's an interesting person because she had so much treasure. But I guess that's, and I know I said that to Brother James, and he said he's interested in finding out more about her books and the receipts, and I think that would be a really interesting way to study what she really valued. The other thing that another really small thing that made me laugh when we were talking about the 70s, and you said it was a dark time for museums, and I thought it was a dark time for a lot of churches too, actually, you know, and we talk about the beauty of keeping something the same and not losing, whether it be the liturgy or the steadiness of the collection. She really did sort of circumvent a lot of the loss of beauty in the 70s. I don't remember what the last thing I wanted to say was, but I'm just very excited to be here, and I hope we can continue to have these conversations. I do remember the last thing I wanted to say. I just want to give a massive round of applause and congratulations, especially to Diana, because for us to be able to have this conversation and for her to come into this space, you know, and you don't know, you're off of your home court. Like, the museum is your home court. This is what I said to you earlier, but you came here into a space of people who we can just kind of assume have a certain perspective, and were so open-minded and took these questions, not knowing what it was going to be, and it's just a huge honor to have your expertise, Natalie's expertise, and to have you so open to have these conversations around religion and Isabella when you don't necessarily need to. So I really appreciate that. I hope that they continue to happen because, as you said, you've got this massive Gen Z audience, and that was the last thing I wanted to say, is that Gen Z is converting to Christianity at huge rates that we haven't seen pretty much ever before. And so if your audience is really primarily Gen Z, it's only a matter of time before that becomes part of the conversation, since they are converting in such large numbers. So I hope we get to have more of these conversations. And Rachel, if you want to close us out, I don't feel I should go into it.
How much time have we got? I don't.
Well, we're due to finish at 4 or before, so we have a little time.
Okay. Well, I don't need to close us out just yet, but
Fine.
do I? Okay.
Depends on how profound the words of wisdom are. Not that in the spirit of the earlier comment we want to apply any pressure.
Continuing the no pressure thing. What do I want to say?
Yeah, I can say one thing about receipts.
Yes, why do we have
Continue the
historians
discussion.
weigh
Yes.
in?
Continue the discussion. Absolutely.
30 seconds, yeah.
One institution that she was the most important contributor to was a school is now called the Cotting School, but it was at the time, it was called a name that we would never use now, but it was out of the progressive era, Industrial School for Crippled Children. And so she had such a heart for all those who were unseen, not seen. And one of the most moving parts of the history of the Cotting School was the founders, whose names escape me. They said, not only are we going to educate these students, but we're going to have the very best classrooms, the very best furniture in the classrooms. She funded their expansion of a building. She funded a playground. I was trying to see, but the number that comes to mind is $250,000 over the course of her contributing to that school. So the Cotting School is now in Lexington, but it really, when I went to talk to the director, she said we would have had to close without Isabella Stewart Gardner. And yet there's really not a lot of, there's a small plaque, right? She did it quietly. She didn't trumpet that receipt.
No, I think that's great. And yes, we in fact do have the receipts for many of the things she bought. She has impeccable records for many of her purchases, which is actually really helpful. But I think that's an excellent point. The museum is just the most prominent and obvious record of what she cared about and spent money on. And it was a lot of money. She spent a lot of money on us, but we're not it. And I think it's important to recapture the relationship with SSJE, the relationship with Cotting, the Perkins School for the Blind, with the Advent
Humane Society.
Humane Society, she loved, oh yeah. Fun fact, she names 4 dogs and 2 horses in her will. Not to give them money, but in their honor, there are lots of donations. Shout out to Foxy and Rolly and Lady Pluto,
Yeah, you're
Dolly.
Yeah.
There's some others
Yes.
who I'm forgetting.
Is there a limit?
Kitty Wink and Patty Boy.
Yeah.
Thank you. It's all in there somewhere. But yeah, I think it's really important. The receipts is a really good point because when we talk about the museum, we focus about what you spent on us, right, and what we still have. But actually, there's a more holistic picture there. And to the point that I think you made, and I always like to bring up, she only started building the museum when she was 59 years old.
Yeah.
There's a whole life lived with plenty of wealth to be donating before that. And I don't know, and Natalie's research has helped us recapture some of that, but it doesn't mean it's yet been like fully integrated into our understanding of her.
There's more to find. There's always more to
Always.
find.
Can I actually ask another question?
By all means.
It's not too late to open up another question. I just have been curious as we've been talking about sort of Isabella Stewart Gardner's theological literacy, what she read, what she believed. What do we know, looking at you historical people at this table, what do we know about what she read, sort of beyond the kind of aristocratic curriculum of learning languages and the basics? I mean, we know she read Dante, and yes, Dante is theology. But did she read other theology? Did she have any kind of theological education that might have informed informed what she believed? Or is it more appropriate to think of her as having had sort of the basic catechesis while being an enormously sophisticated person and remaining in and cultivating environments of learning and talking to people? Obviously, she was a huge conversationalist and talked to all sorts of learned people throughout her life. But I'm wondering what the role of her library, not in terms of what was rare and collectible, but in terms of what she actually read that might have shaped her.
She read a lot of Dickens.
Yeah, she read a lot, right? And I should say there are books that are in the museum collection, which are on display and rare and collectible. She starts as a rare book collector. I often joke that Dante was her gateway drug to Italian Renaissance art. I think something that is interesting and also kind of fits into the Anglo-Catholic influence, she's very into Ruskin. She reads a lot of Ruskin, Walter Pater. She and Berenson have exchanges about this. So this pre-Raphaelite approach is something she's really versed in. And again, there are one of these moments. There's a bookcase in the short gallery. It's sort of just to your left, in front of you when you walk in from the Raphael room. And there's a Ruskin drawing above it, and in it are all her kind of Ruskinite art books. And so I think that's another thread, which is it a theology of sorts, maybe.
Theological aesthetics.
Yeah, exactly, right? I think there's probably an argument for it, and that's clearly something she's reading. She also does have a personal library, things that were on the 4th floor, things that she read that weren't kept in the galleries and therefore not considered part of the permanent collection. So we can have a decent sense of what she read. Cards on the table, the books are not fully, completely cataloged. It's a long process, but they're out. We have records of the basics of them. But that inscription that I found in that Mexican book, I thought you'd like that one. Yeah, I know. Is only because I can go and I can click through and yeah. So anyone else want to respond?
I can say 2 sentences and they're not.
She doesn't write in the margins of her books, and you so wish she did. And so Henry Adams has a huge collection of his libraries at the Massachusetts Historical Society, and it's wonderful because you know exactly what he's thinking about. He says no, exclamation point, not true, dumb, right? So so you get a real sense of him and it's silence, and that's hard. I do know there's wonderful, wonderful detail. She would have the Brookline Public Library ship her the newest copies of detective novels. She loved reading detective novels.
Yeah.
So. But that's not a theological education. So.
All right, I don't know if this is Natalie or Diana because I read both of your books. I think it's Natalie because you were talking about her childhood at Grace Church. One of you has a line where you say like the Anglican children's book of prayer that she learned from, and I know this because I ordered them when I read it in your book. I have it at home because I grew up Roman Catholic, so I was like, well, I wonder what her formation was. It's small, it's green, it's like line by line or something like that. Does that sound familiar to anyone?
Oh, it should sound familiar to me, but are you talking about the green covered book is the Bible that she inherits from her?
No, I know that one. That one.
Yeah.
No, I'm
So
kidding,
it's
I'm
line a day. It's like
It's like a
is
little-
it? I should have a
Yeah.
Yeah.
Here we go. Yeah. Let me see if I can find it. It might be Amazon.
I think you might be referring to the sort of the guide for proper womanhood, right? Is that the one? Is that the book that you're referring to?
Children's Anglican prayers, and I'm pretty sure that yours are the only biographies I read, but maybe I was reading more than I knew.
I wish I could remember that, and I can't say that I recall that specifically in her childhood. But
There were all sorts of volumes like that published, so it doesn't surprise me in the slightest. So, yeah.
Well, mindful as I am of the time, and that we are going to have afternoon tea in the finest English manner, before we then have the lightly themed evensong with the full choir in honour of the day. So I do commend that to your attention and hope you will all join us for that. But even though I'm tempted by the late entry of no less a figure than Ruskin, not to mention Pater, to open very large new chapters, which I think is certainly material to be thought of further. They're both hugely striking additions to influence, and indeed have a lot of related material, but we will not go down that rabbit hole just immediately. It falls to me, therefore, just to say really very briefly, in a word of appreciation, how grateful we are to have gathered this illustrious panel. And I know that Clare McCallan in particular is anxious that we capture some of this terrain potentially in a film, I think, that you're wanting to work on. So I do say that that speaks to something that we want to do here also at the Advent, which is to sustain this discussion, and we would like to be a place that can perhaps contribute especially to the question of what the religious dimensions are in all of this terrain. But I do want to say, in particular, a special word of thanks to each of our panellists, Clare, Natalie, Brother James, Diana, and of course our own Father Ian, along with Rachel, for what has been, I think, a remarkable day and has offered us many splendid insights into what I suppose we might call the intricate loveliness of Isabella, Stewart Gardner. I ask you all to express your thanks in the customary way.